Caleb Harmon never once said thank you for a meal his wife cooked. Not in 6 years of marriage. He'd push back from the table, wipe his mouth with the back of his hand, and say something like, "It's edible, I suppose," or worse, say nothing at all and just walk outside to check on the horses. Nessa used to watch him go and wonder what exactly she'd married. She wasn't sure anymore. Maybe she'd stopped wondering. Nessa Harmon, Nessa Briggs before she married into the Harmon name, had grown up cooking for 8 people in a 2-room house outside Laramie, Wyoming. Her mother taught her how to stretch a pound of ground beef into a meal that could feed a family of 10 if you knew what to add and when to add it. She knew how to brine a chicken overnight in buttermilk and herbs from the garden. She knew which wild onions along the creek were worth for pulling, and which would turn your stew bitter. Cooking wasn't something she did to impress anyone. It was just something she knew, the way you know how to breathe. But Caleb had made it very clear, early on, that he didn't consider what she did in the kitchen to be any kind of skill. "My mother's biscuits were lighter than these," he'd said once, maybe 6 months into their marriage. He wasn't cruel about it. That was almost the worst part. He said it the way a man might mention the weather. Offhand. Like it was simply a fact. Nessa had looked at him across the table that evening, at his square jaw and his pale eyes, and the way he held his fork like it owed him something, and she'd decided then that she would not let it break her. She was 26 years old. She had married a man who ranched 500 acres of high desert scrubland in southern Montana, and she was going to make this work. She was practical that way. Always had been. She was also, if she was being honest with herself, not the kind of woman men like Caleb Harmon typically ended up with. She knew that. She'd known it the day he asked her to marry him, standing outside the Harmon family church with his hat in his hands, looking almost surprised at himself. She was broad-shouldered and plain-faced and stood 5'4" on a good day, with hands that were already roughened from work before she ever set foot on his land. Her mother had called her sturdy. Her oldest sister had called her sensible. The women at the Harmon family reunion, the summer she and Caleb got engaged, had called her quiet, mostly because they didn't know what else to say. She had heard one of them, Caleb's cousin's wife, a thin woman named Trish, who wore her hair in a permanent French braid, whisper to someone in the bathroom that she didn't know what Caleb was thinking, that surely he could have done better. Nessa had been standing on the other side of the door, holding a casserole dish, and she hadn't said a word. She'd just waited until the voices moved away, and then carried her food to the table and set it down next to the other dishes, like nothing had happened. She was like that. She held things quietly, inside a place no one else could see. The ranch was called Harmon Ridge. It had been in Caleb's family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather to his father to him, and Caleb carried that history in his body the way men carry old injuries, with a particular kind of stiffness, a guardedness around it, as if he were afraid that touching it wrong might make everything collapse. He worked the land hard. She would give him that. He was up before the sun most mornings, out past dark in calving season, and he expected the ranch to respond to hard work the way machinery responds to maintenance, predictably, logically. But ranching wasn't predictable. Ranching was weather and water rights and beef prices and broken equipment, and years when everything lined up and years when nothing did. And by the spring that Nessa turned 32, Harmon Ridge was having one of the bad years, one of the worst, as it turned out. It had started the winter before, when they lost 11 calves to a cold snap that came in fast and mean off the Rockies. Then the well pump on the east pasture blew in February, and the repair cost twice what Caleb had budgeted. The hay supply they'd stored from the fall ran short. They'd had to buy supplemental feed at a price that made Caleb go quiet at the kitchen table for 3 days straight. In March, one of their best bulls developed a foot problem that the vet said would need monitoring through the season, limiting the animal's usefulness. By April, Caleb was making phone calls behind the barn that he didn't tell Nessa about, and she knew, because she knew how sound traveled on flat land, that the calls were to the bank. She didn't ask about the calls. She waited. She was patient the way deep water is patient, still on the surface, but moving underneath. What she did while she waited was cook. She cooked the way she always had, not because anyone was watching, but because there was still food to put on the table, and because the act of making something good out of raw ingredients steadied her the way prayer steadies some people. She made short ribs braised in coffee and molasses when the weather was still cold. She made cornbread that you could eat plain, or with butter, or with the chili she kept simmering on the back burner for whoever came through the door. When the 2 ranch hands, a young man named Pete and an older one, everyone called Wick, Stayed late into the evening during the rough weeks. She always made sure there was enough for them too. Pete, who was 22 and from Oklahoma and clearly hadn't been fed decently since he'd left his mother's house, started lingering after supper. He'd sit at the end of the kitchen table with his hat in his lap and say things like, "Mrs. Harmon, I don't know what you put in that gravy, but I haven't eaten this good since Christmas." Nessa appreciated that. She never said so, but she did. Wick was more reserved. He'd worked for 3 different outfits across Montana and Wyoming over the years, and had the weathered quietness of a man who'd learned that ranches come and go. He ate whatever she set in front of him and said thank you and meant it, and that was more than enough. Caleb didn't say much at the dinner table anymore. He ate quickly and then went over papers or made more calls. Sometimes Nessa caught him staring at the window over the sink, and she knew he wasn't seeing the yard outside. He was running numbers in his head that didn't add up. The first real sign that things were worse than she'd understood came on a Tuesday evening in late April when a man named Douglas Feld drove out to the ranch unannounced. He was from the bank, the regional branch in Billings, not the local office. He wore a jacket that was too clean for ranch country, and he had the particular kind of careful politeness that told Nessa immediately he was not there with good news. She offered him coffee. He accepted. She put a plate of oatmeal cookies on the table because she had made them that morning and there was no reason not to. She sat with them only long enough to pour the coffee, and then she found things to do in the hallway where she could hear without being obvious about it. Douglas Feld said the words operating line of credit and current exposure and collateral review, and several other things that Nessa had to work to understand, but the center of it was clear enough. The ranch had borrowed against its future in the fall, and the future was not going the way anyone had planned. The bank was not going to close the line. Not yet. But they were watching, and they expected to see a plan. She heard Caleb's voice, lower than usual, with a tightness in it she hadn't heard before. He said they'd find a way. He said Harmon Ridge had been through hard years before and come out the other side. Douglas Feld said he appreciated that perspective and hoped it would prove true. He ate 2 of the cookies on the way out. Nessa stood at the kitchen window and watched his car go down the dirt road and around the bend and then disappear behind the tree line. She stood there for a long time. That night she didn't sleep well. She lay in the dark listening to Caleb breathe and thought about her mother's kitchen, about the way a meal could be made out of almost nothing if you understood what you were working with. She thought about the road through Harmon Ridge that connected to the state highway about 4 miles south. She thought about the beef auction that happened every year in mid-May down in Dillon. She thought about the church potlucks she'd been bringing food to for 5 years. How people always made a point of finding out who had made which dish. And then she thought about a conversation she'd had 3 months ago with a woman named Patrice Holden, who ran the agricultural extension office in town and organized the county fair and had a habit of knowing things before most people did. Patrice had mentioned, in passing, that the Copper Bluff Lodge, a hunting and guest ranch about 18 miles from Harmon Ridge, had lost their camp cook and was struggling to find a replacement in time for their spring season. The lodge catered to wealthy clients from out of state who came for fly fishing and elk scouting and paid significant money for the privilege. Part of what they paid for was food. The camp cook wasn't just someone who made meals. They were part of the experience, the reason guests remembered their time at the lodge and came back the following year. Patrice had said this to Nessa the way you mention something that might be interesting to someone who knows someone. She hadn't meant it as a suggestion. At least, Nessa didn't think she had. But lying in the dark with the numbers running through her head, she started to think about it differently. She didn't tell Caleb what she was thinking. She wasn't sure he would hear it the right way, and she couldn't afford for it to go the wrong way. So instead, the following morning, she called Patrice. "The lodge position," she said. "Is it still open?" Patrice was quiet for a moment. "As far as I know," she said. "They're getting desperate. Season starts in 3 weeks. Who do I call?" His name was Graham Aldert, and he managed the Copper Bluff Lodge with the exact combination of charm and anxiety that you'd expect from someone who catered to wealthy clients while also trying to keep a working ranch operation running in the background. He had an easy handshake and a cautious smile, and when Nessa sat across from him in the lodge's main office and told him she was interested in the camp cook position, he looked at her the way she had come to expect men to look at her when she said something they hadn't anticipated. Surprised, but trying not to show it. "Have you done this kind of cooking before?" he asked. "I mean, Large groups, outdoor settings, the full setup? Nessa had cooked for every harvest crew that had come through Harmon Ridge for the past 6 years. She had fed 22 men in a field in 100-degree heat. She had set up a folding table next to a hay baler and served hot food in 30 minutes flat. She had once improvised a full meal for 16 people when the propane ran out and she had to finish everything on a wood fire. She said yes. Graham asked her to come back on Saturday and cook a test meal. Lodge staff only, about 12 people, full outdoor setup. She agreed. She went home and did not tell Caleb where she had been. That Saturday, she drove to the lodge at 6 in the morning with 2 coolers and a cast-iron pot she'd had since before she was married. She cooked skillet cornbread with green onions and sharp cheddar. She made a braised brisket she'd started the night before, slow and low, until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. She put together a wild mushroom and potato hash from scratch and served it alongside a simple green salad dressed with apple cider vinegar and a little honey mustard. For dessert, she made a brown butter peach cobbler in a Camp Dutch oven with the coals arranged just right, which was something her mother had shown her when she was 9 years old and which she had never once failed to get right. The lodge staff ate in mostly silence, which Nessa recognized as a good sign. People who eat in silence are paying attention to the food. Graham Aldert ate 2 full plates and then sat back and said, "When can you start?" She started the following Monday. She still didn't tell Caleb. It wasn't dishonesty. Exactly. It was strategy. She knew her husband well enough to know that if she came to him with a plan before she had proof the plan worked, he would find reasons it wouldn't. He would say it was too far. He would say she was needed at home. He would find some quiet way to discourage it that was worse than an outright refusal, because it would sound almost reasonable, and she wouldn't be able to argue against it without seeming unreasonable herself. She had spent 6 years navigating that particular current. She knew where the rocks were, so she said she was helping Patrice with some county fair prep. She said it a couple of mornings, and then she stopped saying anything, because Caleb wasn't asking. She drove the 18 miles to Copper Bluff every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, arriving before dawn, cooking through the morning and midday for the lodge's first rotation of spring guests, and returning home in the late afternoon in time to start supper. She was tired in a way she hadn't been in years, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing something you're good at and doing it well. The guests responded the way she'd hoped. A retired couple from Connecticut, who had been coming to the lodge for 11 years, said the food this year was the best they could remember. A group of fly fishermen from Texas demanded to know who had made the sourdough and whether they could take some home. A woman named Beverly, who had come alone from Chicago for a week of hiking and writing, stopped Nessa outside the cook tent on the 3rd day and said, "I have eaten at some excellent restaurants in my life, and I'm not just being polite." Nessa said thank you and went back to her work. Graham was paying her better than she'd expected. Better than she'd asked for, actually. He had offered a rate that surprised her, and she had been careful not to let it show on her face. She had opened a separate account at the bank in Dillon, not the branch that held Harmon Ridge's operating line, and she deposited every payment there. She didn't touch it. She was building something, and she needed to know the shape of it before she did anything else. The shape became clear in the first week of June. By then, the lodge's spring season was fully underway, and Graham had asked her to expand her days. She was driving out 5 times a week now, cooking for groups that sometimes ran to 30 people, managing a full outdoor kitchen setup with 2 assistants he'd assigned to help her, a quiet teenage girl named Bree who could peel a case of potatoes in 15 minutes flat, and a middle-aged man called Ray who had no culinary training whatsoever but was strong and reliable and did exactly what she told him without comment. By the first week of June, she had saved enough. Not all of it, not even most of what Harmon Ridge needed, but enough to cover the shortfall on the operating line through summer, which would give the ranch time to recover. If the summer went reasonably well, and if Caleb made some adjustments she had been thinking through carefully. She had run the numbers herself, on a notepad at the kitchen table in the early morning before Caleb was up. She wasn't an accountant. But she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had managed a household budget on an income that would have made most people despair, and she had watched and learned. She asked Patrice to meet her for coffee. She needed someone else to look at the numbers before she took them to Caleb. Patrice looked at them for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, "Nessa, where did this money come from?" "I've been cooking at the lodge." Patrice looked up. "Graham's lodge? Since when?" "May semi. Does Caleb know?" "Not yet." Patrice was quiet again. She had the good sense not to tell Nessa what to do. She just said, "You're sure about the numbers? I've checked them 3 times. Then you should tell him." She told him on a Sunday evening. She waited until supper was done, and the dishes were cleared, and Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, which is where he usually sat when his mind was heavy. She sat down across from him and put the notepad on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. "What is this?" he said. "I've been working at Copper Bluff Lodge since May," she said, "cooking for their spring season. This is what I've saved. It covers the shortfall on the operating line through end of August, which buys us time if we're careful." She laid it out plainly, the way she always laid things out, without drama, because the facts were enough. Caleb was quiet for a long time. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the notepad like he was trying to find an error in it. "You've been going there since May," he said. Not a question. A statement he was working out. "Yes, without telling me. I told you once you'd have a reason it wouldn't work," she said. "I needed to show you it did first." He was quiet again. Outside, she could hear Pete crossing the yard on his way to the bunkhouse, his boots on the gravel, and then silence. "Graham Aldert's lodge," Caleb said. "Yes, and they pay you for this." "They do." He looked at the bottom number on the notepad. She watched his jaw tighten, not in anger. She knew what his anger looked like, and it didn't look like this, but in something she didn't have a word for, something harder to look at than anger. "Nessa," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. "I didn't know," he said finally. "That you could." He stopped again, picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. "I didn't know this was something you could do." She looked at him across the table. 6 years of meals he hadn't thanked her for. 6 years of comments like it's edible, I suppose, and silences that said the same thing a different way. She thought about Trish in the bathroom at the family reunion. She thought about the feeling of standing on the other side of that door holding a casserole dish, waiting for the voices to move away. She thought about all of it, and then she let it sit there between them, where it belonged. "I know," she said. "It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was just the truth," said the only way she knew how to say it, cleanly, without embellishment, and with all of her weight behind it. Caleb Harmon sat across from his wife at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in June, and for the first time in the 6 years she had known him, he looked genuinely ashamed of himself, not defensive, not looking for an explanation or an excuse. Just sitting with it the way you sit with something that cost you something. He said, "I'm sorry, Nessa. I should have said that a long time ago." She didn't say it was fine. She didn't say don't worry about it. She wasn't interested in making it easy for him. She just nodded once and said, "I know that too." The ranch made it through the summer. It was close. It required Caleb selling 2 parcels of equipment he'd been reluctant to part with and negotiating a different payment schedule with the feed supplier, both things Nessa had suggested in the margins of the notepad, and both things he eventually did. She kept working at the lodge through August, and by September, when Graham asked if she wanted to come on for the fall hunting season, she said yes without hesitating, and this time she told Caleb at breakfast, before she'd even called Graham back. He said, "Is the pay the same?" She said it was. He said, "Okay." That was all. But she understood it for what it was. Pete left for another outfit in the fall, the way young hands do, and Wick stayed on through winter, the way the reliable ones do. Nessa kept cooking for the lodge 2 days a week through the cold months, enough to keep the extra account building steadily. In the evenings, she cooked for her own household the way she always had, braised things and slow things, and simple things that warmed the kitchen and smelled like something worth coming home to. Caleb started staying at the table longer after supper. He'd refill his coffee and sit there while she finished cleaning up, and sometimes he'd talk about the day. Small things, ranch things, nothing remarkable, and she'd listen, and sometimes she'd add something, and it wasn't much, but it was something new, something that hadn't been there before. He didn't say the food was good every night. She didn't expect him to. But there were evenings when he'd finish his plate and look at whatever she'd made with something that took her a while to identify, because she wasn't used to seeing it aimed at her. Appreciation, just that, plain and unhurried, like he'd finally stopped rushing past it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just kept cooking, and he kept eating, and slowly, the way a current changes in deep water, not with any drama, not all at once, just with time and movement and persistence, something between them began, carefully and without any fanfare, to turn. The following spring, when Copper Bluff Lodge put out their season brochure, Graham Aldert listed the dining experience as a featured attraction for the first time. He'd asked Nessa to write a few words about her approach to food. Something short that he could put alongside the description. She thought about it for a few days and then wrote, "Good food doesn't announce itself. It just makes people stay longer at the table." Graham said it was perfect. Caleb read it in the brochure and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's true, you know." Nessa looked at him. "The staying longer part," he said. "I know what that's about now." She put the brochure down on the kitchen counter and went back to what she was doing, and she let herself quietly, in the privacy of her own chest, feel the full weight of that. What it had taken to get here, what she had built without anyone's permission or acknowledgement or help, what she had proven not to him, not to Trish, not to anyone outside herself, but to the part of her that had stood behind that bathroom door at 25 years old holding a casserole dish and decided, without drama, to keep going. That part of her had known even then. She just hadn't had the proof yet.